Hi there, welcome to my kitchen. I'm going to have a go at recording a video talking about the difference between Keynesian and classical economics. There are probably as many different views on this as there are economists, but here's a potential story at least. Neoclassical economics started a long time ago, people like Adam Smith and so on. And what they believed is that fundamentally, under the right conditions, an economy at a macro level can self-stabilise. And by self-stabilise, what we mean is if there's some sort of negative shock like a recession, a fall in aggregate demand that triggers falling GDP, then the economy can, under the right circumstances, return to some form of equilibrium. And what we've been looking at is the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So, they only believe that this will be true under certain circumstances. The idea that neoclassical economists believe that the economy will self-stabilise by magic isn't true. But what they're saying is that if we have perfect product and labour markets, in other words, supply and demand works effectively in the market for labour and also in the market for products, and probably some other assumptions as well, but that doesn't concern us at the moment, then under the right circumstances, the economy can return to the NAIRU. If we examine how this might be the case, if we move to my superb graphic number one, then here we have an ADAS diagram with the economy in equilibrium at A. Suppose then that we have our shock. Aggregate demand falls to AD2, and the economy moves into a short-run equilibrium at point B. Output has fallen to Y2, and price level has dropped slightly to PL2. So the question is, what happens next? The economy's below its potential, depending on how you define that, and unemployment is high. One version of what happens next is that because unemployment is high, wage rates start to fall. Because wage rates start to fall, firms' costs start to fall. As costs fall, the short-run aggregate supply function starts to shift to the right. So here we are at SRAS2, and we're at point C. The economy is still below its capacity. Unemployment is still above the NAIRU, and as a result of this, what's going to happen is that wages are going to continue to fall. And so what then happens is that, again, wages fall, costs fall, the price level starts to fall, and as the price level is falling, what's happening is we're getting an extension along the aggregate demand function. In other words, aggregate demand is increasing as a result of the lower price level, short-run aggregate supply 3, short-run aggregate supply 4, and the economy eventually returns to a new equilibrium at point E. So what's happened is that aggregate demand falls, unemployment rises, wage levels fall, costs fall. There's my cat making a noise over there. The price level falls as a result of the fall in the price level, which we'll talk about in a minute. And they're not very straight, those lines, are they? Oh, never mind. As a result of the fall in the price level, aggregate demand extends, and we return to some form of long-run equilibrium at point E. And what that means is that in the long run, the economy has self-stabilised, and classical economists believe that the long-run aggregate supply function is therefore vertical. And all that's saying is that the economy can return back to some form of equilibrium, but with a different price level. So, why is it that a fall in the price level? Why is it that short-run aggregate supply shifting to the right is going to cause aggregate demand to rise? And there are probably three key reasons for this. Firstly, the real balance effect. As the price level falls, the real value of your savings becomes greater. So the amount of money that you needed to hold as a precaution or something, you don't need as much because price levels are lower. Therefore, perhaps people will save some of that surplus income. Secondly, perhaps people will consume some of that surplus income. Secondly, a fall in the price level will also help to make UK goods and services more competitive. So as a result of cheaper goods, exports are going to rise, and therefore again, aggregate demand is going to rise. And thirdly, the level of the real money supply is going to be greater. So if you think about money sitting around in banks, if the price level is lower, what that means is that effectively, the value of a £10 note is greater than it used to be because the prices of what you would use it to buy are lower. So effectively, banks now have more loanable funds. Banks have more cash available to lend. They want to make profit, so therefore they need to find a way of lending it. So therefore, potentially interest rates are going to start falling, as a result of which consumption, investment, and so on are also likely to rise. So hence, that's that mechanism then. Yeah? So in summary, one version of the neoclassical story is fall in aggregate demand, unemployment rises, wages fall, production costs fall, the price level starts to fall, as a result of which, because of the real balance effect, the export effect, and also because of the increase in the real money supply, which pushed down interest rates, as a result of that, aggregate demand rises and the economy returns to some form of equilibrium. Okay, Keynesians don't like that. And their argument is that, kind of returning to fantastic graphic number one, their argument is that this self-stabilization process isn't going to happen, and all that's going to happen is the economy is going to get stuck here at point B. So aggregate demand falls, the economy moves from A to B, and that's it. So why do Keynesian economists argue that that's true? Again, their argument is that, in reality, labour and product markets, they're not perfect, and you're unlikely to be able to make them perfect, certainly in the short term. And the reason they say they're not perfect is firstly, they would argue that wages are unlikely to fall in the way that neoclassical economists might predict. And this, in the real world, they point to the fact that there are trade unions, which can resist pay reductions. There are employment laws, contracts and so on that make it easier, employment protection that makes it easy for workers to resist pay cuts or to push for pay rises. Thirdly, there's the idea of loss aversion. People like pay cuts a lot less than the equivalent of a rise in price. Most people wouldn't toss a fair coin for plus or minus £1,000 because the fear of losing is greater than the happiness from winning. And fourthly, things like the national minimum wage. So firstly, it's possible that wages aren't going to fall. Secondly, they'd say even if wages do fall, it's not necessarily the fact that product markets, the markets for goods and services, are necessarily very competitive. So the argument there is that even if firms' costs start to fall, it may well be the case that prices don't fall. And I think we can. And the reason for that is things like monopolies and oligopolies. And I think those of us in the UK who've looked at energy markets and so on can sympathise with this view. The idea that when the costs to the energy producers fall, these cost falls aren't passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices. It seems to have some traction at least. And thirdly, they would argue that the complex argument we made a minute ago about the real money supply pushing down interest rates. Keynesians have pointed out that there are circumstances in which interest rates have fallen so low that we're in a liquidity trap. In other words, interest rates are already zero, and therefore they can't fall any further, and therefore that element of the increase in aggregate demand isn't going to work. So what Keynesians would say is, we're not going to end up at point E on the diagram. We're going to be stuck at point B. Therefore, we have two options. Wait for a very long time, or the government needs to intervene to return the economy to some form of higher level of employment. So Keynesians would recommend using either monetary or fiscal policy to boost aggregate demand. In the case of monetary policy, they could cut interest rates. This might not be powerful enough if a recession is particularly serious, and therefore what they might need to do is to use fiscal policy. We could cut taxes like income tax. The danger with cutting income tax is that this generally affects people who have jobs and their marginal propensity to consume that may not be high. If confidence is low, they may prefer to stick their money into savings accounts or into a pension fund, and therefore, in an extreme case, what Keynesians recommend is that we should borrow money and stick it into infrastructure. The government should increase the national debt. It should increase its borrowing requirement, and it should engage in what are sometimes called public works. In other words, we should borrow money and use it to build roads and bridges and infrastructure, HS2, that type of stuff. As a result of which, we'll get a multiplier process. People will be employed; those people will then have income because they were previously unemployed. They'll need to spend, most of their income. Their marginal propensity to consume is high. In other words, they'll go out to pubs and shops and so on, and therefore jobs will be created there, and so on and so forth. And that sounds like a fairly plausible story. Neoclassical economists don't like it, of course, and this is where we end. This is where we end with the austerity debate. As you'd be aware, over the last few years, there's been a big debate as to whether governments should borrow more, or whether, in fact, they should be paying down their debts. Keynesians standardly would argue that borrowing more is fine. You can pay it back when the economy has recovered. Neoclassical economists don't like this for several main reasons. Yeah. Firstly, they don't like monetary expansion because they argue that what this can do is it can sow the seeds for another bubble. Yeah, so the current financial crisis was caused by a housing bubble. Neoclassical economists would argue that this was a response to a previous recession. So if we look at fantastic graphic number 2. Yeah, and what you should be able to see is if we look at U.S. interest rates, you can see that in 2000, which way is my hand? I have to go that way. In 2000, we can see that there was a very sharp cut in U.S. interest rates. This was in response to the dot-com bubble bursting. There are various events here. There's 9/11, a bit later, but. If you look at what happens in the U.S. housing market, of course, interest rates are quite low. Yeah, so therefore, in the housing market, what happens is that it becomes much easier to borrow. This is the rate of change of house prices, and if we line that up, that big decrease in interest rates was 2000, 2001. If you line that up, you can see that as the years pass, the rate of change of house prices accelerates quite rapidly. Now, that's all fine, but eventually, of course, turn back to this one, eventually interest rates rise, as the central bank needs to bring inflation under control. People who borrowed money at very low interest rates now can't pay it back. The housing bubble bursts, bang, and what we've now got is we've got the next recession. So hence, one argument is that you're just going to make things worse. Yeah, that pushing liquidity into the system, cutting interest rates, will just create another bubble, and that's what neoclassical economists argue is malinvestment. Yeah, that because you make interest rates so low, people will be much more likely to engage in speculative activity, putting money into shares or property and that type of stuff, and you won't get the real investment that the economy needs if it's to increase its potential. In other words, back in the original diagram, to actually shift the long-run aggregate supply schedule to the right, back in the one that we talked about at the start. So that's monetary policy. On the fiscal side, they're also not happy about increases in national debt, and there are a variety of reasons that they're not happy about this. One is that they believe that big increases in national debt, big increases in firstly borrowing and then national debt, are going to make it much more difficult for governments to borrow in the future. That what's going to happen is that bond yields are going to rise, and there's certainly some evidence of this during the Eurozone crisis. Here we have bond yields across different countries, and what we can see is at the beginning of the financial crisis, the loss of confidence in countries like Greece and Ireland and Portugal, where government debts were quite high, has led to big increases in the borrowing costs for those governments. The extent to which this is necessarily going to happen to the US and the UK and Germany and so on is open to debate, and certainly bond yields haven't risen in the UK and the US. Now, some would say this is because the British government has committed to reducing its borrowing requirement, that there's a degree of credibility. Some would say that it's just not going to happen to Britain. Anyway, that's a potential risk. Linked to that then, secondly, is if you are borrowing lots of money, then you've got to pay interest on it. If you've got to pay interest on it, then there's an opportunity cost. So in the UK at the moment, just the interest on our national debt is costing us about £50 billion. And when you think that the education budget is only about twice that, then that's quite a high opportunity cost. Thirdly, there's the argument that if the government's borrowing a lot of money, then this can crowd out the private sector. I mean, this can happen in a variety of ways. Obviously, one is that if the government is very active in financial markets, there's less money for private sector firms to borrow. That's simplistic. A more complex argument is that the government operating in bond markets, it makes it harder for private sector firms to compete for funds, and therefore the interest rates that they will have to pay will have to be higher. So therefore, what then would neoclassical economists argue is the right response to a credit crunch, to a financial crisis? What they would be saying is, well, look, if you stimulate the economy, you're going to lead to a big build-up of debt that has to be repaid. There's a risk that you're going to create another bubble. Therefore, what we need to do is return to our original situation and say, well, okay, if product and labour markets are more flexible, then the economy can self-stabilise. Therefore, what we need to do is we need to make those product and labour markets work better. So, firstly, we don't increase government borrowing. In fact, we should try and reduce it, and to try and make it easier for private sector firms to borrow money. This is the reverse of crowding out, sometimes called crowding in. And secondly, we need to make product and labour markets work more effectively. Hence, we need to reform labour markets by reducing the powers of trades unions, perhaps reducing or abolishing the minimum wage, making it easier to hire and fire. In product markets, we need to privatise inefficient and uncompetitive state-run enterprises. We need tougher anti-monopoly laws, tougher competition laws to force firms to compete, so that now our process does begin again. Yeah. So in other words, unemployment rises, wages fall, costs fall. Unemployment rises. So therefore, because we've reformed labour markets, wages do fall. Because wages fall, costs fall. Because costs fall, now prices fall, because product markets are now very competitive, and hence the economy